Hello and welcome to Why Do We Do That, a psychology podcast that deconstructs human behavior from the perspectives of social scientists, psychologists, and others that use applied psychology in their work. I'm your host, Dr. Ryan Moyer. In this episode, I spoke with Dr. Gregory Gorelik. Greg is an evolutionary psychologist who currently works as a research scientist at a private mental health organization in Austin, Texas. The primary theme of our conversation was the idea of sexual selection. Sexual selection basically describes a type of natural selection where traits become beneficial, not because they directly help with survival per se, but they do help attract and retain mates, which ultimately helps that individual pass their genes on to the next generation. I enjoyed talking to Greg. Greg touched on a wide variety of studies within evolutionary psychology, and I think my conversation with him underscores how important evolutionary principles are to explaining human behavior. The human brain has so many documented patterns of behaviors: the food we prefer, what we are afraid of, what we find attractive in mates. And it's fun to explore how our ancestral environment has influenced these preferences, some of which may not make any sense unless you're looking at them through the evolutionary lens. The impetus for wanting to talk to Greg was a piece he wrote for Quillette, discussing possible evolutionary explanations for various BDSM practices. For those of you that don't know, BDSM is a term that describes various types of erotic role-playing using dominance or submission, bondage, etc. We didn't spend as much time as I would have liked to on this specific topic, but there's just so little research in this area that it's hard to talk at length without doing a lot of speculation. Nonetheless, we talked a lot about dominance and submission and how it relates to sexual selection, as well as other related studies in the evolutionary psychology literature. I hope you enjoy it. All right, I'm here with Greg Gorelik. Greg, it's nice to have you on the show.
Good to be here.
So, Greg, you're an evolutionary psychologist, and you have some very specific research interests under the umbrella of evolutionary psychology. So why don't you just start off giving a little bit of an overview of what those interests are?
Sure. So after graduating with my psychology degree, I got into evolutionary thinking by reading Dawkins, among other authors. And then that kind of steered me into a study of sex differences and how male and female reproductive strategies differ, how we've evolved different, psychological manifestations of our reproductive kind of motivations, and how that manifests itself in what we do and who we're attracted to, in how just our emotional, physiological, and just psychological perception of sexuality, relationships, or, our romantic lives in general.
Okay, and so how does evolutionary psychology relate to what are the specific principles that are worth noting when it comes to how males and females interact and are attracted to each other?
Sure. Well, Darwin was, I guess, the foremost, originator of our understanding of sexual selection, which is basically that evolution doesn't only create adaptations and physical and psychological and behavioral properties that are tied to survival, but also to successful reproduction.
Right. So something that wouldn't help an animal or a creature survive, but helps with attracting a mate, and that's
attracting
a specific goal, right?
Attracting, or having, or attaining access to a mate. So just that arena of sexual reproduction, unlike say asexual reproduction, creates certain kinds of traits and behaviors that would not otherwise evolve. Darwin famously, felt sick to his stomach because he couldn't understand the peacock's tail. But when he realized that it was a sexually selected trait, that basically it was something that appealed to peahens, to female peacocks, well, that made a whole lot of sense. And you could have this evolution of very kind of wildly beautiful and almost useless traits. But if they serve a purpose in securing reproduction, then they would be favored by selection. The other kind of foundational theory that is necessary to understand not just sexual selection or sexual, or the evolution of sexually selected traits, but specifically male-female differences in what is valued, is Trivers's parental investment theory. And that basically posits that whichever sex invests the most in reproduction, and that includes not just the sexual act itself, but also pregnancy, lactation, child rearing. Whichever sex invests the most in those behaviors, that would be the more choosy sex. So in the case of most mammals, most mammalian species, it's the females who do the choosing, and the males who compete for access to reproduction.
Right. Yeah. So that makes perfect sense. Right. So that being said, you've written a lot about some of these more specific behaviors related to this dynamic between men and women and sexual selected behaviors. You've written a lot about dominance and subordination. Let's start with dominance. Is dominance dominance one of many traits that females are looking for in males?
I believe so, yes. I think I don't want to get too bogged down in definitions, but when we talk about things like dominance, things like power, things like even aggression, if we go to the extreme, in my mind, they are all manifestations of a predilection for competitiveness. So men dispositionally are more competitive than women. It's not to say that women are not competitive. In fact, there is such a thing as intrasexual or between women competition, women female competition. But men particularly are prone to competitiveness because of that initial difference in parental investment, because there are fewer women who are open to mating, either because in our evolutionary environment they're nursing, they're with a child, they're child rearing. There are fewer women in the mating market, so to speak, and because of that, men have to contend with one another for access to those few reproductive opportunities that are offered by the few women in the environment.
I
So
see.
that creates.
Yeah. So let me rephrase or parrot back this to you, because I'm trying to make sure I understand this correctly. So the idea is that if women or females are trying to secure a mate, they want to see that the mate is competitive, because if the mate is competitive, they'll be able to provide them resources as they go through the childbearing process.
Yes, I mean that is what I believe is happening. So there has been some tension in the evolutionary literature ever since Darwin, where a sexually selected trait, it's difficult to parse how much of it is the result of, say, male-male competition. Is it just that some males can defeat their rivals, and whatever traits allow them to defeat their rivals, those are the ones that are passed on because they just have access to the mates? And how much you know is female choice responsible? How much does female choice explain the origin of and maintenance of these traits? Basically, is it because they're favored in the context of male-male competition, or are these traits favored and by females themselves directly?
Right.
And
And
I
also,
believe that it's hard to parse the one from the other. And in fact, as some of the research, I believe by Birkeland on and some colleagues on a variety of species, where they looked at all kinds of different ornaments that are favored by females. And then they looked at all kinds of different armaments, which they kind of distinguish armaments from armaments that are favored in male-male competition scenarios. When they looked at all of these sexually selected traits, they noticed that the majority of them, and something like 49 out of 50, or however many they looked at, were favored, were useful in both male-male competition and female choice. So there's this overlap between what is beneficial to a male in defeating his rivals, and what a female hones in on as being attractive.
so what are your thoughts on the traits that would clearly differ in terms of what would benefit male to male competition and male to female bonding or pair bonding? So, for example, we've been talking about dominance and competitiveness a little bit, but if you have a male that expresses sort of an unrestrained kind of aggression, that could help them in male to male competition. But if that kind of carries over into their intimate relationship or relationship with the female, that could be disastrous, right? The aggression just boils over. It turns into some sort of, using aggression and physical violence to, try to obtain a certain outcome with their mate, right? So how does that work? How does that dynamic play out?
Yes, no, that's a very good point. And that's kind of one of my motivations for researching this topic. Basically, how is it that we have this link between aggression and sexuality? And if you look at history, if you look at at studies of human sadomasochism, etc., why is it that this aggressiveness is manifest in the sexual act? I mean, doesn't that pose a danger to your mate when if you're actually being aggressive during the sexual act, during copulation? How why didn't selection select that link out? If how strong or how weak that link is, we can get into. But that's my initial kind of like puzzle. What makes it, why is it, why have that link at all? We understand why men are aggressive or competitive with other men, but why would it make sense, or if it does make sense, or if it doesn't make sense? Basically, there is a need for an explanation as to why aggression is at all transferable to the sexual act between a man and a woman.
Yeah,
So that's a very good.
I find it seems interesting. There's this common theme in terms of using evolutionary psychology to explain behavior, where like a little bit of something is great, but too much causes negative outcomes. And I'm fascinated with that aspect of the explanatory process. So it leads me to a specific question I have for you about assertiveness, right? So if you think about, I mean, I think it's not controversial to say that females tend to prefer a more assertive. So we're talking about a little bit more modern versions of assertiveness now, but they prefer an assertive male in heterosexual relationships. But the devil's always in the details, because assertive in the sense of I'm choosing, I want a female wants someone to the male to choose where to go to dinner is great. You get bonus, you get +1 for that. But if the assertive is I choose who your friends are, assertiveness is now not a desirable trait. Women don't, that would not be an attractive trait. So in terms, from what you understand about this dominance and assertiveness as being something that is selected for in the sexual sense, How do these difference in behavior? What are the key behaviors that will increase mate value versus not?
Well, that's a very good question, Ryan. And I guess to preface the answer, I just want to say that just because something is not palatable to us living in our modern environments, where you have a boorish guy who controls his partner's, friendships, controls where she goes, etc. I mean, obviously we rightfully scoff at it, but that doesn't mean that, number one, that doesn't happen, that didn't happen in history or in some, cultures today more than in others. And two, it doesn't mean that those behaviors are not adaptive. And in fact, when you look at research on birds, mammals, and including humans, you see that mate guarding is a common phenomenon, and it doesn't just, it's not just directed, by men toward women, or from men toward women, or women also do some of their own mate guarding as well. But because of men's physical strength and ability to be more successful at coercing their partners, it does seem to be more prevalent with respect to men's control of women's behavior, or men's proprietariness of women's behavior, women's sexuality. And this is culturally manifested in certain societies where you have the veiling of women, even female circumcision, or genital mutilation, as it is more accurately described. And these are all factors that need to be taken into account. That yes, we can say that something is probably not a result of female choice, but at the same time, it doesn't mean that it hasn't helped our male ancestors in some way. I'm not saying that it's an adaptation, but it doesn't mean that that was not prevalent, or is kind of, it counteracts men's reproductive interests.
So what
That
you're saying is sort of the it's kind of like our appetite, in the sense that humans, crave salty, fatty foods, and those appetite preferences were developed in pre-human ancestors because that it was the appetite for that fit the environment. It was, if you had a craving for salty, fatty foods or high calorie foods, you were more likely to pass on your genes to the next generation. That when you couch that in the modern time, that appetite could have some negative consequences. And it sounds like you're saying that this sort of being overly assertive and mate guarding, where you're controlling your spouse's relationships, theoretically that might have had some sort of benefit in the evolutionary environment, but now it's gone, it's bankrupt. Is that kind of what
that mismatch theory is what you're referring to? It could be. I suspect that it that there were also, mechanisms in place in our evolutionary environment that would mitigate some of this, assertiveness. So that's the other side of the coin. And particularly, there's some research, I forget who the researchers are, that show that women who live close to their natal family, who live close to their fathers, their brothers, they tend to experience less sexual violence, than women who live further away. And so, in our ancestral environments, women, with our cousins, the chimpanzees, we are a patrilocal species, basically, where women at a certain age, come puberty, I guess, they migrate away from their, natal, natal camp, natal tribe, natal, clan.
Mm-hmm.
And they seek out a different group where they, can settle down, find a mate, and rear children. But in our evolutionary environment, that, I don't think they trek that far. And so having your male relatives close by, probably mitigated some of those, coercive aspects of male sexuality.
Okay.
But they were still there.
Right. Now, you've written about some evolutionary perspectives on BDSM. So more of a so could you just give an overview of some of your thoughts and how you feel that evolutionary psychology relates to BDSM?
Sure. So, as I mentioned earlier, I guess my interest was in this paradox. Why is it that we allow aggression into the bedroom? What good does it serve either party? And that kind of led me onto, a road of research and speculation. Obviously, there has to be some evolutionary undercurrent. So, for example, when we look at the prevalence of sadism and dominance versus masochism and submissiveness, and they're different, but for our conversation's purpose, let's just clump them together.
Well, now are we talking about, so just to step back for a second, are we talking about, this is role playing within an intimate relationship?
Yes, we're talking about consensual sadomasochism in the modern world.
Okay.
So when you look at who the sadists and who the masochists are, in general, men are just more interested in all kinds of weird sexual. I don't want to call it weird. I mean, I refuse to judge sexual practices that don't harm anyone as wrong or bad or weird or whatever. But
Right.
if you look at all kinds of sexual proclivities that are outside of the norm, it's mostly men who are interested in those kinds of activities. But so whether it's dominance or submission, it's guys are predominantly the ones who are kind of interested in dominatrixes notwithstanding.
Sure.
But if you look at sex differences within that sphere already of who is more interested in dominance versus submission, men are overwhelmingly more likely to be interested in dominance than women.
That makes sense.
And obviously it makes sense from an evolutionary perspective, and that is not to say that there are no sociocultural influences on the manifestation of these sexualities, but it does hint at something deeper underlying the expression of these these sexual behaviors, and I do believe that parental investment, specifically men's competitiveness, has something to do with the origin of sadomasochistic behaviors, or at least sex differences with respect to bondage, sadism, masochism, submission, etc.
So even though you've established that there's a preference for these dominance scenarios that men prefer, how like, what are your thoughts about when the script is flipped? Because obviously, we've heard of whether it's in television or maybe even know someone where there's the high-powered businessman, and he goes to to a dominatrix or whatever, and becomes dominated, right, for sexual pleasures or something like that. Like, how do these examples fit into the narrative that that evolutionary psychology is contributing to some of these BDSM practices?
Right. Well, the short answer is I don't know. The longer answer is that we are an exceptionally malleable species when it comes to how culture influences our sexuality. My guess would be that, because we are fairly flexible in the development of our sexuality, it doesn't mean that there are no kind of canalized pathways that kind of, create some guardrails for how we develop sexually. But they're kind of far between. And in general, my feeling is that men, because of their just generally higher sex drive, and we see this in research from across the world, and looking at interest in pornography, interested in patronizing sexual workers. Men are in general have a higher sex drive, but that sex drive can be manifest in all kinds of different ways. And with respect to sadomasochism and why some men are into submission, there's still that aspect of power play, and whether they're on the receiving end or the giving end, it's still there's still that heightened kind of excitement from just power in general, or power dynamics, or differences in who holds the power and whatnot. And men in general are more hierarchical. They're more hierarchically inclined than women. Again, necessary caveats that women can be just as competitive in some domains, but that would be my guess, and it's still a big question mark as to how these kind of differences develop, and why we have certain kind of sexual practices that are outside of the norm.
So, in to your knowledge, what other topics related to sexual preferences have been attempted to be tackled by evolutionary psychology? Because I'm just curious, because to me, on the surface, it seems like a stretch to use the evolutionary environment to talk about something as specific and modern as BDSM practices. Has evolutionary psychology attempted to tackle other sort of modern manifestations of sexuality, whether it's pornography, for example, things like that? Does evolutionary psychology have something to say about those domains?
Yes, there's some work on pornography, and of course, I mentioned how men are the predominant viewers of pornography. There is some work on the kind of the supernormal stimuli aspects of pornography, where again, going back to that mismatch hypothesis, where in our evolutionary environment, we weren't exposed to such I guess exuberant manifestations of sexual behavior as we are when we are exposed to porn, or even just turning on our television or whatever. So in the sense that these supernormal stimuli, and basically they're aggrandized version of our evolved sexual or the kinds of sexual behaviors that we were exposed to in our evolutionary environment, because they're so exaggerated, it kind of it creates that supernormal stimulus where it might change your attitudes, it might change your behaviors. I don't know enough about the literature. From my kind of understanding, they're the whole notion of pornography addiction is a little overblown. The whole notion of of kind of pathologizing a pornography use is that has gotten some pushback. So whether that supernormal stimulus kind of discussion, how much of it might explain our usage of pornography, etc., that's still kind of a work in progress. That's still up for debate. There's also some evolutionary research on specific accoutrements of attractiveness, not necessarily sexual behavior, but there's some work on how high heels might accentuate certain traits that men find attractive. I know Leif El-Shawaf did some work on the lumbar sacral ratio, where wearing high heels creates a certain ratio around the lower back and buttocks area of a woman that could appeal to a man. I'm not too familiar with much of the work there, but there has been some work on that, some work on makeup, and how women might be using makeup in intrasexual competition dynamics. So it's not necessarily just to appeal to men, although I suspect that it's a part of the story. But it's also that makeup and luxury goods like purses, for example, Gucci purses or whatever, might also be signaling status to other women. So you have some female competition dynamics there. With respect to sadomasochism, I'm not, I wouldn't say that it's kind of that it's a stretch from.
Well, so with respect to that, obviously there hasn't been a ton of attention paid to this topic area within evolutionary psychology. Where would you like to see the research go? Where would you, what type of questions are most interesting to you when it comes to trying to describe and explain this area of human behavior?
Yeah, well, I mean, I would be interested in kind of, in understanding what are the psychophysiological underpinnings of this behavior. And I think just for much of the research in evolutionary psychology, I think an understanding of what goes on in our brains would be helpful. It's good that we're looking at behaviors, but understanding how, one um, type of phenomenon, for example, sexual drive, sexual excitement, could be related to another type of phenomenon, which is power, aggression, dominance. I mean, seeing that, how the two might be actually triggered physiologically. I mean, we have to look at that to really answer these questions about, the evolutionary history of these two factors. And of course, we cannot look at our brains in isolation. We have to tie this ultimately to behavior, and understanding the proximate level, kind of like the in the now level dynamics are occurring within a BDSM scenario, say. That would be helpful. And there has been some work, I'm forgetting, I believe Sagarin and colleagues have looked at kind of the testosterone or hormonal um, you know uh, factors surrounding the sadomasochistic experience. They actually went into a sadomasochistic scene or an event, and they actually took salivary testosterone measures from before, from during, and until after. And there were some interesting findings that they found. But I think looking at these proximate level issues it's helpful, but in order for us to truly understand why it is that humans can engage in such behaviors within the sexual realm, we have to answer some of these more evolutionary, some of these more distal level questions.
Okay. So I think the take home is, if you're listening and you're on your way to your BDSM club, just be friendly towards the researchers that show up, because we want
That's right.
we want to learn more about this topic.
Incorporate them into the kind of erotic scene in some way. Make eroticize the science.
The perfect, yeah. So basically, just maybe they could have a researcher fantasy. Do you like to be observed by someone wearing?
That's right. No, it's
Yeah.
voyeurs, and that's a big one. Yeah, there's probably some interesting evolutionary dynamics there with the voyeurs and exhibitionists. Absolutely.
Well, on that note, I'm going to wrap it up. Greg, thank you so much for being on and talking about this interesting path down the road of evolutionary psychology. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, it was very enjoyable, Ryan. Thank you for having me on.
For more on Greg, visit his website at gregorygorelik.weebly.com. Once again, that's gregorygorelik.weebly.com. Weebly is spelled Weebly. You can also read some articles that Greg has written at Quillette.com. That's Quillette.com. And if you would like to hear even more about evolutionary psychology, check out episode 1 of this podcast with Dr. Todd Shackelford. Don't forget to follow the Why Do We Do That Facebook page for updates and additional content. Also, don't forget to rate and review us on iTunes. Follow us on Instagram at Why Do We Do That Podcast. Also, Twitter at WDWDTPod. Once again, that's WDWDTPod on Twitter. You can also email me at whydowedothatpodcast@gmail.com. Until next time, this is Dr. Ryan Moyer, hoping you found some answers to the question, why do we do that?